28 employees yesterday. This after a series of protests over the company's contract to provide the Israeli government and military with cloud computing and AI services. Some also said they were protesting the, quote, harassment, intimidation, bullying, silencing, and censorship of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim Googlers. On Tuesday night, 9 Google workers were arrested on trespassing charges after staging a sit-in at the company's office in New York and Sunnyvale, California. In an email last night, a Google executive telling workers that 28 people were fired. They were found to be involved in protests that took over office space, defaced property, and impeded the work of other Googlers. Joining us right now is Jason Greer, Greer Consulting founder and president. And I'm going to start with this very question.
Yes.
Would you hire any of these folks who were fired yesterday for being involved in this protest? Meaning, was it disqualifying? I mean, we're partially asking, should have they been fired? But we're partially asking, now that they've been fired, should they have an opportunity elsewhere or not?
100%. I would hire these folks in a second because they are clearly true believers. In terms of the question, should they have been fired? Look, Google set this precedent back in 2018 when employees staged their own share of walkouts, and they said that we don't agree with the work that they were doing in Project Maven. Google shut it down. So why wouldn't they attempt to do the exact same thing today? What's the difference between 2018 and today?
Don't you think, I mean, I would make a different argument to you. I would actually say there's a big difference between 2018 and today, which is that Google has tried, I think, quite vehemently to change the culture of the company and to make it clear that these types of protests are not allowed. And so the question is, yes, if that was part of the culture then, but if you have an explicit arrangement and you're an employee of a company, there are channels with which you can protest, if you will, and have your voice heard. But having a sit-in, trespassing, defacing property and the like, goes to a question about judgment. And I think that there is a question about whether you want to hire people who have that judgment or not.
If I'm looking to hire people who are willing to hold me accountable to the missions and values of our company, absolutely. Got to understand, with the average Google worker, they're not looking at the fact that we work for Google. They're looking at the fact that since we work for Google, we work for the world. The decisions that we make as a company will impact the world. But this is why I say to tech companies, especially CEOs, because I talk to them all the time, this is exactly the reason why we're seeing union organizing going through the roof in the tech industry. Because the thing that Google's facing is what many other tech companies are facing, is that they have employees who are legitimately saying or asking the question, what do we stand for? And if we determine what we stand for, what are we going to do to make sure that we continue to stand for that very thing? So what the tech industry is seeing today is exactly what manufacturing saw 60 years ago, where workers are asking the ultimate question, what do we stand for?
Jason, it's a difficult subject, and I think especially because we're in it right now, and we see what's happening in Gaza, in Israel, and people rightly have feelings about who's right in that situation. But I think if you take the specifics out of it and you just say, hey, protesting at a company when they tell you not to. If we go back to the 80s and we're talking about South Africa, right? Or if we go back a little further and we're talking about civil rights in this country, you know, can we say that people who have protested, despite a company saying that they shouldn't be hired anywhere else?
Absolutely not. I mean, I understand. You just talked about the fact that we're talking about, you know, civil rights back in the 60s. Thank God we had those folks that sat in, those folks that sat in lunch counters, because I wouldn't be here today having this conversation with you. I think what it comes down to is there has to be two sides to this. On one side, the employers have a responsibility not only to their shareholders, their responsibility to their external shareholders, their stakeholders, which are the employees. On the other side, what employees need to take a look at is, if we're going to hold our company accountable, what are the channels? And this gets back to the original question. What are the channels that we need to follow internally to make sure that we're holding the company accountable? Do we talk to our managers? Do we talk to human resources? Do we talk to the executives? Do we have to hold internal forums before we do these big, you know, sit-ins and these protests? I think ultimately what it comes down to is that in the case of Google, in the case of their employees, but I'd say this to any other company, before it becomes this huge mushroom cloud where it becomes so radioactive that we don't know where we're going, you have to start asking these questions internally and having these internal conversations, because if not, you're going to continue to have the same issues.
By the way, I don't disagree about the fact that employees should have views. I have views about all sorts of things. I have views about what my employer is doing, and there should be channels with which you can participate in a conversation. But if the company decides that they don't want to listen to you, then the question is, you can decide to work there or you can decide not to work there. It's unclear to me whether you should be able to stage a protest that potentially shuts down part of the company for some period of time and then expect to keep your job and expect to get a job elsewhere.
Absolutely. Well, you should be able to stage a protest if that's your choice, because that's what it means to be American. But at the same time, you've got to understand that there are consequences to your action. If you decide to hold a protest, you decide to do a staging where you're legitimately closing down offices, chances are pretty good you're going to get fired, or in the case of some of these employees, you're going to get arrested. In terms of their long-term futures on being hired, man, in the 80s, you could stage a protest in Missouri and then go work for a company in Texas because they never heard of it, right? They didn't hear anything about it unless that company happened to know somebody that worked for the company that you didn't. Today, because of the internet, because of social media, those employees' chances of getting jobs elsewhere are probably slim to none, at least for the next 2 years, unfortunately, because hiring managers talk to hiring managers, in addition to the fact that the moment that I Google your name and I see that you stage a protest, I might not want you to come work for me. That's the unfortunate reality. They decided to take the chance. They took the chance. They got fired. Now they're unfortunately going to possibly deal with the consequences.
It sounds like you'd like to hire one of them, or maybe more. Jason, appreciate you joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.